States.
What he reveals about his relationship with Donald Trump, including the president's ask for advice.
Trade disputes in North American history, and the U.S. side still hasn't come to the table. Let that sink in for a second, because what it means is that this isn't a complexity problem. It's a willingness problem. This isn't just politics, and this hits your wallet. Whether you're paying more for groceries, watching your savings erode, or wondering what happens to your job in the next 6 months.
There's a moment in every major economic story where everything looks like it's about one thing, but it's actually about something else entirely. And in this case, that moment came during a one-on-one conversation with markcarney. Because what he revealed in that interview wasn't just about policy, or leadership, or even Canada. It was a signal. A very calculated signal about where things are heading next. And if you're paying attention, it tells you a lot more about your future than you might think. Let that sink in for a second. Now here's what's happening. Over the past few months, global markets have been moving in a way that doesn't quite add up on the surface. You've got rising costs in some sectors, unexpected resilience in others, governments making big announcements, and behind it all, a growing sense that the old economic playbook isn't working the way it used to. And then you have Carney, sitting down one-on-one, choosing his words very carefully. This isn't just another political interview.
And hammer the whole thing out over the course of 10 days if the U.S. side had the bandwidth and the inclination to go through it. But it takes two to negotiate, and they're not all the way there. That's not a taunt. That's a strategic signal. He's telling Washington and the world that Canada is ready. The delay isn't on our end. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the structural position Canada is in right now.
Tell me which country you bumped into that's pleased with their deal.
You don't think there are any?
Well,
The U.S. currently maintains hefty tariffs on Canadian steel at 50%, aluminum at 50%, copper at 50%, lumber at 10%, plus anti-dumping duties pushing the effective rate past 45%, and a 10% baseline tariff on most other goods under Section 122 of the Trade Act. These aren't minor adjustments. These are trade barriers at levels not seen since the Great Depression era. And here's the part most people miss. CUSMA-compliant goods are still exempt from the baseline tariffs, which means roughly 90% of Canadian exports still flow duty-free. But the sector-specific tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, lumber, and auto parts, those are hammering industries that employ hundreds of thousands of Canadians. The gap between what Canada is actually paying and what it could be paying if CUSMA falls apart in the July review, that gap is enormous. And that's exactly why Carney is playing the long game instead of rushing into a deal that patches one hole while opening three more. This flew completely under the radar, but Carney also said something fascinating about his approach to dealing with Trump directly. He said there's no value in misrepresenting your position or sugarcoating things, and that Trump respects strength and can see through obsequiousness.
This is someone who has spent years at the very center of global finance, from leading central banks to advising governments during crises. When someone like that speaks in a controlled setting, every sentence is doing work. And more importantly, every sentence is designed to be heard by a very specific audience. This affects you, whether you realize it yet or not. Because when decisions are being made at that level, they don't stay there. They filter down into interest rates, job markets, business investments, and ultimately, the cost of your everyday life. So here's where this gets interesting. But before we break this down further, subscribe to Canada Policy for clear, in-depth analysis on the moments shaping Canada's future. One of the first things Carney emphasized in that one-on-one wasn't a bold promise or a dramatic headline. It was something much more subtle.
Revenue tool. They're a political messaging tool, and rolling them back on Canada means setting a precedent for every other country in line. But economically, that's where it falls apart. And the numbers tell a very different story than the headlines. Everything I just told you sets the stage for what I'm about to show you. Because the second bombshell from this interview is the one that should worry every country that already signed a deal with Washington. Where we left off, Carney had just laid down his 10-day challenge. But the next thing he said might be even more significant, because it wasn't just about Canada. It was a warning to the entire world. Carney said, and I'm not making a judgment here, I'm relaying exactly what a sitting prime minister stated publicly, that a lot of countries rushed into deals with the U.S., and those deals were not worth the paper they were written on. That's an extraordinary claim. He's talking about framework agreements signed by the UK, Japan, the EU, South Korea, and others. These were presented as diplomatic victories, headlines everywhere. everywhere celebrated them. But Carney is saying the countries that signed them aren't happy with what they got. This is the part that caught me off guard. Let's look at what these deals actually delivered. The UK agreed to a 10% tariff on most goods and a limited auto quota. Japan committed $550 billion in US investment in exchange for a 15% tariff rate. The EU settled on a 15% baseline. But here's what didn't change for any of them. The 50% tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper remained in place across the board.
He focused on stability, on long-term positioning, and on what he described as building resilience into the system. Now that might sound like standard political language, but it's not. Because when someone like Carney starts talking about resilience instead of growth, that's a shift. That's a signal that the environment ahead is expected to be volatile enough that survival, not expansion, becomes the priority. Think about that. For years, the global economy has been built around growth at almost any cost. Low interest rates, high liquidity, aggressive expansion.
Negotiate or face escalating rates. That time pressure forced governments to accept framework agreements that were, in many ways, just tariff reductions from artificially inflated levels. Think about it. The US threatened 50% tariffs, countries panicked, and then celebrated when they negotiated down to 10 or 15%. But 10 to 15% is still dramatically higher than the near zero rates that existed before. So the baseline shifted. What was presented as a deal was really just a managed retreat from a manufactured crisis. And the concessions these countries made, the investment pledges, the purchase commitments, the regulatory alignments, those are real and lasting. The tariff reductions they got in return, those can be reversed by executive order tomorrow.
But now, the tone is changing. And Carney isn't reacting to that change, he's anticipating it. This is the part most people overlook. When leaders start preparing for resilience, it usually means they see risks that aren't fully visible yet to the public. Not necessarily a collapse, but a period where things don't move as smoothly as before. Supply chains get disrupted, capital becomes more selective, and governments start playing a much more active role in shaping outcomes. And that brings us to the deeper layer of what he was really saying. Because throughout that conversation, there was a consistent theme: control. Not control in the sense of restriction, but control in the sense of direction. Steering investments, guiding industries, and making sure that critical sectors, energy, infrastructure, technology, are not left entirely to market forces. Now, why does that matter? Because it changes how opportunity works. In a purely market-driven system, opportunities are scattered. But in a system where governments are actively guiding outcomes, opportunities become concentrated. They move toward areas that align with national priorities. And if you're not paying attention to those priorities, you miss where things are actually going.
Data suggests the trade deficit hasn't meaningfully changed, while consumer costs have risen sharply. That's a gap between intention and outcome that keeps widening. And it's not just an economic question, it's a political one. With US midterms on the horizon, every dollar of tariff cost that lands on an American household is a vote that's up for grabs. The administration knows this. In November, the US quietly rolled back tariffs on coffee, beef, and other consumer staples facing sharp inflation. That's not a sign of confidence, that's damage control. And this is where the story stops being about economics and starts being about something bigger, because Carney's third revelation changes everything we thought we knew about what's really happening behind closed doors. This is where my jaw dropped, because nobody saw this coming. In the same interview, Carney revealed for the first time what happened during his private meeting with Trump roughly a year ago. And the first question the president asked him wasn't about tariffs. It wasn't about lumber or steel or Kuzma. It was about Iran. Carney said, "At the lunch, the first question the president asked me was about Iran and what I thought he should do about Iran." So this is an issue that's been on the mind of this president. Now hold on, because this is where the story takes a turn. Think about the context. This was a meeting supposedly about trade. Canada's prime minister flies to Washington. The world is watching, expecting tariff negotiations, and the first thing that comes up in private is geopolitics. That tells you something profound about where Washington's real attention has been. And when you look at what's happened since that conversation, conversation, the picture comes together. In late February 2026, the US and Israel launched military operations against Iran. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard responded by effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz, the waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil and 20% of global LNG passes. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Brent crude surged past $126 a barrel at its peak. Oil production across the Gulf.
Now here's where the shift happens. At one point in the conversation, Carney touched on global uncertainty, not as a temporary phase, but as something more structural, something that's becoming part of the baseline. And that's a big deal. Because if uncertainty becomes the norm, then the strategies that worked in stable environments stop working. Businesses become more cautious, consumers become more selective, and governments step in more aggressively to stabilize things. And do not forget to
remains
subscribe
closed through the second quarter. WTI oil prices could average $98 a barrel, and global GDP growth could drop by nearly 3 percentage points annualized. If it extends to 3 quarters, oil could reach $132, and the growth hit deepens further. I sent this to a friend, and their response was exactly what mine was. Are you kidding me? Carney said something else that barely got attention. He said Canada is looking at ways to help reopen the strait, specifically by aiding allies in removing mines once a durable ceasefire is reached. He framed it carefully. We're not a superpower, but where we can play a role constructively, we should. This is Canada positioning itself in the global security architecture at a moment when energy security is the single most important issue on every government's agenda.
And this is where everything starts to connect. You have geopolitical tensions increasing in different parts of the world. You have energy markets facing unpredictable shocks. You have trade relationships being renegotiated in real time. And layered on top of all of that, you have inflation pressures that don't seem to fully go away. Individually, each of these factors is manageable. But together, they create a system that is much harder to predict. And that's exactly the kind of environment where someone like Carney operates best. Now let me explain why that matters to you. Because when the system becomes harder to predict, the margin for error gets smaller. Decisions that used to be low risk suddenly carry higher stakes. Whether it's investing, starting a business, or even choosing a career path, the consequences of being wrong become more significant. At the same time, the rewards for being right increase. That's the trade-off. And this is where the conversation takes another turn. Carney didn't just talk about managing risk, he also hinted at positioning for what comes next. Not just protecting what exists, but actively building for a different kind of future. And if you read between the lines, that future looks very different from the one we've been used to. It's more regional, less globalized, more strategic, less reactive, more focused on essential industries, less dependent on speculative growth. Now here's the part that really stands out. He didn't frame this as a temporary adjustment, he framed it as a transition. And that changes everything. Because transitions create winners and losers. They shift value from one area to another. They redefine what's important and what isn't, and they reward the people who recognize the shift early. Let that sink in.
The right time, and what we don't need is chasing a small deal that disadvantages us. That distinction matters enormously. Every other country that rushed to the negotiating table accepted what was essentially a managed reduction from inflated tariff levels. They got headlines. Carney is betting that patience gets better terms. I'll be honest. When I first read this, I thought it was a mistake. Why would you publicly refuse to negotiate quickly when your industries are under pressure? But then I looked at what's happening on the ground. The CUSMA review is scheduled for July 2026. That's the single most important trade event in North American history right now, because if the agreement isn't renewed or is fundamentally altered, the baseline tariff exemption that protects 90% of Canadian exports disappears. Everything currently flowing duty-free suddenly faces 10% or more. Oxford Economics has called that the worst-case scenario for the Canadian economy. So Carney's calculus is clear. Don't waste negotiating leverage on a small tariff reduction now when the real battle is the Kuzma review in 3 months. Save your chips for the hand that actually matters. Let's translate this into something concrete. If the current tariff structure stays in place through the rest of the year, the combined effect on Canadian households is significant
if we are in a
but
transition
manageable,
period,
largely
then the
because
question
Kuzma
isn't
compliance
just
shields.
what's happening now. It's what will matter most when this transition is complete. And that's not always obvious in the moment. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. Throughout the interview, there was an underlying confidence. Not in the sense that everything will go perfectly, but in the sense that there is a plan, a direction. And that's important, because uncertainty without direction leads to panic, but uncertainty with direction leads to opportunity. And Carney is clearly operating in the second category. He's not trying to eliminate uncertainty. He's trying to navigate it. And that's a very different mindset. So what does all of this actually mean in practical terms? It means the environment you're operating in is changing, whether you notice it or not. The signals are already there. The language is changing. The priorities are shifting. And the people making decisions at the highest level are preparing for something that looks different from the past decade. It means stability is becoming more valuable than speed. Strategy is becoming more important than scale. And awareness is becoming one of the most powerful advantages you can have. Because when things change, the people who adapt early don't just survive, they position themselves ahead of everyone else. Now think about your own situation, the industry you're in, the decisions you're making, the direction you're heading. Are those aligned with where things are going, or where things used to be? That's not an easy question to answer, but it's the right one to ask. And this is where we come back to that one-on-one conversation. Because what made it so important wasn't any single statement. It was the pattern behind the statements, the consistency in the message, the subtle but clear indication that the world is moving into a different phase, a phase where the rules are being rewritten in real time. So here's the question. If you had access to that same perspective, if you could see the direction things are heading before it becomes obvious to everyone else, would you change the way you're making decisions today? Or would you wait until the shift is already complete? Because by the time it's obvious, the opportunity is usually gone. Let me know what you think.